Taxes did not begin as weapons. They began as agreements. In the earliest human settlements, communities needed certain things that individuals could not provide alone. Walls for protection, storage for grain during winter, perhaps a well that required more labor than one family could give. And so, contributions were made. A portion of the harvest, a few days of labor, small offerings that kept the community intact. These early contributions were simple. A village elder might remember who had given what, or perhaps marks were made on clay tablets. Nothing elaborate, nothing permanent. The system worked because it was small. Everyone could see where their contribution went, the wall they helped build, the granary they helped fill. There was a direct connection between what was given and what was received. As villages grew into towns, the system needed to grow with them. Someone had to keep records. Someone had to decide how much each household should contribute. Someone had to store what was collected. This was not yet taxation as empires would know it. It was still localized, still visible. A farmer could walk to the town center and see the grain storage he had helped fill. He knew the people who managed it. He understood the system. In many early civilizations, temples managed these contributions. Priests kept records. They had the education to write and calculate. They had the authority that came from religious respect. This arrangement worked for a time. Temples needed grain for festivals and for feeding those who worked on religious monuments. Communities needed organization that individual farmers could not provide. The exchange seemed balanced, necessary even. Then cities began to expand. Populations grew. Walls needed to be extended. More officials were needed to manage more people. Armies formed to protect trade routes that stretched beyond what anyone could easily see. And the contributions that had once been small and occasional became larger and more regular. What had been a harvest offering became a seasonal requirement. What had been a few days of labor became weeks. When cities conquered their neighbors, taxation changed fundamentally. It was no longer about contributions to your own community. It became about sending resources to a distant capital you might never see. The conquered paid because they had no choice. The conquerors collected because they needed to feed armies and administrators who now governed lands they did not originally belong to. The simple agreement between community members became something else entirely. Resources began to flow in one direction, from villages to towns, from towns to regional centers, from regional centers to capitals. A farmer in a distant province no longer saw what his contribution built. The grain he surrendered left his village and disappeared down roads he would never travel. It fed soldiers he would never meet. It supported administrators whose decisions affected him but whom he never saw. Managing an empire required more than priests with clay tablets. It required professional tax collectors, record keepers, auditors who checked the auditors, administrators who managed the administrators. Each layer added to the system meant more of what was collected went to maintaining the collection system itself. Less reached the final destination. But the empire kept growing, so the system kept expanding to match it. What had begun as community agreement became legal obligation. Laws were written defining what must be paid, when it must be paid, penalties for those who did not pay. The tax collector was no longer a neighbor keeping track of contributions. He was an official representing a distant authority. He arrived with soldiers. He carried documents you could not read. He spoke with the authority of an empire you did not choose to join. And yet, life continued. Farmers still planted, merchants still traded, families still raised children. The system had changed, but gradually enough that each generation adjusted to it. What would have seemed impossible to earlier communities became simply the way things were. The baseline shifted, and once it shifted, it rarely shifted back. Empires built elaborate systems for moving resources from where they were produced to where they were needed, or, more accurately, to where those in power wanted them. Roads were constructed, not primarily for trade, though merchants used them, not primarily for communication, though messages traveled along them. Roads existed so that tax revenue could flow efficiently toward the center. In the Roman world, grain fleets sailed on predictable schedules. Egyptian wheat fed Roman populations who produced nothing the Egyptians needed in return. The system called this tribute, or taxation, or provincial obligation. The result was the same. Resources flowed one direction. Chinese dynasties built canal systems that connected agricultural regions to capitals and military outposts. The official purpose was trade and communication. The practical purpose was moving rice and silk that had been collected as tax revenue. The canals made extraction more efficient. These were impressive engineering achievements. They required planning and labor and maintenance. They made empires possible. But they also meant that more places were connected to the extraction system. Remote villages that had once been too distant to tax effectively were suddenly accessible. The roads that brought soldiers and administrators took away grain and silver. The larger an empire grew, the more complex its tax collection became, and complexity created opportunities. Between the farmer who produced grain and the emperor who consumed it, many hands touched that grain. Each hand took a portion. This was not necessarily theft, though some hands took more than they should have. It was simply the cost of operating a large system. Local collectors needed payment for their work. Regional administrators needed salaries. Warehouse keepers needed compensation. Guards who protected tax shipments expected wages. Accountants who tracked everything required support. Every empire discovered the same problem. The further resources had to travel, the less arrived at the destination. A farmer might surrender 30% of his harvest, but after all the intermediaries took their portions, the central government might receive 20%, or 15%, or less. The logical response would have been to simplify the system, make it more efficient, reduce the intermediaries. But empires rarely did this. Instead, they raised the initial tax burden to compensate for what was lost along the way. If 30% collected resulted in 15% received, then collect 40% or 50%. This solved the empire's immediate problem. It created longer-term problems that would take generations to become visible. Many empires discovered that collecting taxes directly was expensive and difficult, so they outsourced the work. They created tax farmers. The system was simple. A wealthy individual would bid for the right to collect taxes in a region. He would pay the empire a fixed amount up front. Then he would collect as much as he could from the population. Whatever he collected beyond what he owed the empire, he kept his profit. This solved several problems for the empire. They received predictable revenue without maintaining a large collection bureaucracy. They transferred the risk to private collectors. If a region had a bad harvest, that was the tax farmer's problem, not theirs. But it created other problems. Tax farmers were motivated to collect as much as possible. They had no reason to care about the long-term health of the economy they were taxing. If they extracted too much and damaged agricultural productivity, they would simply bid on a different region next time. The population experienced this as unpredictable and often harsh. A tax farmer trying to maximize profit before his contract expired would push harder than an imperial official who might govern the same region for years. The short-term thinking of private collection conflicted with the long-term stability empires claimed to provide. And yet the system persisted. It persisted because it worked for those who mattered. The empire received its revenue, the tax farmers became wealthy. The costs fell on those who had no voice in how the system operated. Taxation did not destroy economies suddenly. It wore them down slowly, year after year, generation after generation. A farmer who surrendered 30% of his harvest in a good year might manage. He would have less surplus, less ability to improve his tools or expand his land, but he would survive. The next year, if the harvest was slightly worse, that same 30% would be harder to provide, but he would manage. He would eat less. His family would make do with clothing that was not replaced as often. Then came a year when the harvest failed, not completely, just 20% below normal. But 30% tax on 80% production meant he was surrendering nearly 40% of what he actually produced. Now he had to make difficult choices, sell a tool to meet the tax obligation, borrow grain at unfavorable terms, send a child to work for a wealthy neighbor rather than keeping them on the family farm. Each of these individual decisions was rational. Survival required meeting the tax obligation. The consequences came later. Tools not replaced meant lower productivity in future years. Borrowed grain created debt that carried interest. Children who left the farm did not return. The economic foundation slowly eroded. And this happened not just to one farmer, but to thousands, not in one year, but across decades. Each individual adjustment was small enough to be bearable. The cumulative effect was not visible until it was too late to reverse. Imperial administrators did not see this clearly. They saw tax revenues that generally came in as expected. They did not see the slow depletion of the agricultural base that generated those revenues. By the time the problem became obvious, the damage was already done. When tax pressure became too great, populations adapted. One adaptation was to simply leave. Farmers abandoned land that no longer produced enough to both feed their families and meet tax obligations. They moved to cities. They moved to frontier regions beyond the reach of tax collectors. They moved to estates owned by powerful landlords who could negotiate lower tax rates. This created a cycle. As productive farmers left, the tax burden on those who remained increased. Empires needed the same total revenue, so they spread it across a smaller number of taxpayers. This made conditions worse for those who stayed, encouraging more to leave. Imperial governments tried to prevent this. They passed laws forbidding farmers from abandoning their land. They made agricultural labor hereditary, so children were legally bound to continue farming where their parents had farmed. They increased penalties for those who left without permission. These laws sometimes slowed the abandonment. They rarely stopped it. Desperate people found ways around them, and enforcement was expensive, requiring more administrators and soldiers, which required more tax revenue, which increased the pressure that caused people to leave in the first place. The landscapes of collapsed empires often show patterns of abandonment. Regions that were once fully cultivated, supporting substantial populations. Then, gradually, over decades or centuries, the cultivation contracts. Villages are abandoned. Irrigation systems fall into disrepair. The land returns to scrub and grass. This was not caused by invasion or plague, though those might accelerate it. It was caused by the slow mathematics of extraction. When more is taken than can be sustainably produced, production eventually declines. The process is gradual enough that no single generation sees it clearly. Each generation simply knows that life is slightly harder than their grandparents described. As independent farmers struggled, large landowners prospered. This was not accidental, it was structural. Wealthy individuals had resources to weather bad years. They had access to officials who might reduce their tax obligations. They had the legal knowledge to exploit exemptions that common farmers never knew existed. Most importantly, they could spread risk across many holdings. If one estate had a poor harvest, others might compensate. Tax systems often gave advantages to the powerful. In some empires, large landowners paid lower rates than small farmers. The official justification was that large estates were more efficient and productive. The practical effect was that wealth concentrated upward. Independent farmers facing impossible tax burdens had few options. One option was to sell their land to a wealthy neighbor and continue working it as a tenant. They lost ownership, but they also transferred the tax obligation to someone better able to manage it. From their perspective, this might be the least bad choice. From the empire's perspective, this created problems. Large landowners were harder to tax effectively. They had influence, they had connections, they could negotiate, they could resist. The tax burden increasingly fell on those least able to pay it, because those most able to pay it had the power to avoid it. And once this pattern established itself, it reinforced itself. Wealthy families accumulated more land from struggling neighbors. Their political power grew with their economic power. The system bent further in their favor. Tax rates might increase on paper, but effective rates for the powerful decreased while rates for everyone else increased. This was not a conspiracy. It was simply how systems evolved when those with power shaped the rules in their own interest, generation after generation. Tax systems became more complex over time. This complexity was rarely intentional. It accumulated. An emperor might create a special tax to fund a military campaign. The campaign would end, but the tax would remain. Another ruler might grant an exemption to a particular region or group. The exemption would persist long after the original justification disappeared. Trade guilds might negotiate special rates. Religious institutions might claim immunity. Military veterans might receive preferential treatment. Each individual rule made sense in its immediate context. Cumulatively, they created a system that no one fully understood, not even the officials administering it. This complexity created opportunities for corruption. When rules were simple, violations were obvious. When rules were complex and contradictory, enforcement became subjective. Officials had discretion. Discretion could be purchased. It also created opportunities for evasion. Those with resources could hire experts who understood the complexities and could identify loopholes. Common farmers operating at subsistence levels could not. They paid the nominal rate or something close to it. The wealthy paid something less, though the official records might show otherwise. Periodically, empires attempted to simplify their tax systems. These reforms were usually announced with great fanfare. A new code would be written. Obsolete exemptions would be eliminated. Rates would be standardized. Corruption would be punished. And for a time, the system would be simpler. Then the process of complication would begin again. Special cases would emerge. New exemptions would be granted. The reformed system would gradually drift back toward the complexity it had replaced. This was not because reform was impossible. It was because the forces that created complexity were continuous, while reform efforts were intermittent. Thoughtful taxation affected more than just farmers. It affected the entire economic rhythm of empires. Merchants who might have expanded their operations instead maintained them at current levels. The risk of expansion was high. The potential gain after taxes was modest. Staying at the current scale was safer. Craftsmen who might have experimented with new techniques instead perfected existing ones. Innovation required investment. Investment required surplus. Surplus was what taxation removed. Young people who might have started new enterprises instead joined existing ones. Starting a business required capital. Capital was difficult to accumulate when most of what you earned was extracted before you could save it. The visible effect was not collapse, it was stagnation. The same goods continued to be produced, the same services continued to be offered, but the energy of economic growth diminished. New ideas appeared less frequently. New businesses formed more slowly. The economy continued functioning, but with less dynamism. This was hard to notice in any single year or decade. Economic change is gradual even in the best circumstances. But over generations, the difference became apparent. Empires that had once been economically vibrant became administratively focused. Innovation happened at the edges, in regions where tax collection was less efficient. The center, which bore the heaviest tax burden, became conservative and static. And when external challenges emerged, whether military or environmental, these economically stagnant cores were less able to respond. They had maintained existing systems efficiently. They had not developed the capacity for rapid adaptation that comes from continuous economic experimentation. The taxes that funded imperial stability also slowly reduced the economic flexibility that long-term stability required. Each generation born into a tax system accepted it as normal. This was perhaps the most significant effect of sustained taxation. An elderly farmer who remembered when tax rates were lower might complain about current rates. His children, who had only known the higher rates, simply worked within them. His grandchildren did not remember anything different. For them, surrendering a large portion of production was simply how the world worked. This normalization was not resignation exactly. People still resented taxation. They still tried to reduce their obligations when possible. But they no longer questioned whether the system itself should exist. The question was how to navigate it, not whether to resist it. Empires benefited enormously from this normalization. It meant that tax increases that would have caused revolt if imposed suddenly could be achieved gradually over generations. Each small increase was bearable. Each generation compared their situation to their parents' generation, not to some theoretical ideal of no taxation. Revolts over taxation did occur, of course, but they usually happened when taxes increased suddenly and dramatically. Gradual increases that accumulated to the same total burden rarely triggered resistance. The human mind adapts to gradual change in ways it does not adapt to sudden change. This pattern repeated across different empires and different time periods. Chinese dynasties increased agricultural taxes slowly over decades. Roman provinces saw rising tribute demands spread across generations. Ottoman territories experienced gradual escalation of tax obligations. In each case, the population adapted. They adjusted their expectations. They modified their economic behavior. They found ways to survive within the system rather than challenging the system itself. And this meant that by the time the cumulative burden became visibly destructive, the cultural memory of alternatives had faded. People knew life was hard, but they did not necessarily connect that hardship to tax policy. It was simply the nature of life. In early communities, those who collected contributions were neighbors. They saw the faces of those who gave. They experienced the same hardships. This created natural limits on extraction. In empires, this connection severed. Tax collectors were professionals sent from distant capitals. Administrators who set tax policy lived in cities far from agricultural regions. Emperors who consumed tax revenue never saw the villages that produced it. This distance removed natural restraints. It was easier to demand more when you did not see the consequences. It was easier to dismiss complaints as exaggeration when you had no direct experience of the conditions being complained about. The administrators who raised taxes often believed they were making rational decisions. The empire needed revenue for legitimate purposes: defense, infrastructure, administration. These were real needs. The cost had to be borne by someone. Agricultural populations were the obvious source because they were numerous and relatively immobile. From the capital, the decision to increase agricultural taxes by 5% seemed reasonable. It would fund necessary projects. The empire would benefit. In the villages where that 5% was extracted, the calculation looked different. It meant less food stored for winter. It meant tools that could not be repaired. It meant children who would not receive the same opportunities their parents had. Neither perspective was wrong exactly, but they were incompatible, and the perspective that controlled policy was the one distant from the consequences of that policy. This pattern was not unique to taxation. It appears in any large system where those who make decisions are separate from those who experience the results of those decisions. But in taxation, where the stakes were survival for those paying and revenue for those collecting, the disconnect had particularly severe long-term effects. Much of what was collected as taxes funded military forces. This was true across nearly all empires. Defense required soldiers. Soldiers required payment and supply. Both came from tax revenue. This created a self-reinforcing system. Military power enabled conquest. Conquest brought new territories. New territories provided new tax revenue. New revenue funded larger militaries. Larger militaries enabled more conquest. Until they did not. The same tax burden that funded military expansion also weakened the economic base that made that expansion possible. Soldiers came from agricultural populations. As farming became less viable under heavy taxation, fewer young men chose agricultural life. This meant fewer potential soldiers from the traditional recruiting base. Empires adapted by hiring soldiers from beyond their borders, foreign mercenaries, auxiliary forces from allied peoples, professional soldiers motivated by pay rather than citizenship or land. This worked in the short term. Foreign soldiers could be effective, sometimes more effective than citizen soldiers whose primary occupation was farming. But it changed the relationship between military and state. Citizen soldiers fought to protect their own land and families. Mercenaries fought for pay. When pay was reliable, they fought well. When pay faltered, their loyalty faltered. And eventually, as tax bases eroded under sustained extraction, pay did falter. Empires struggled to meet payroll. Soldiers who were owed back wages became restless. Some defected. Some rebelled. Some simply left to find employment elsewhere. The military that taxation built became dependent on taxation. When taxation declined because the economy could no longer bear the burden, the military declined with it. The empire found itself less able to defend territories it had conquered, precisely because conquering and administering those territories had required taxation that undermined the economy that funded defense. Empires maintained control through presence, officials, soldiers, tax collectors. When these became too expensive to maintain in distant regions, control eroded. This happened gradually. A garrison might be withdrawn because the cost of supplying it exceeded the tax revenue collected from the region it protected. Tax collectors might visit less frequently because the expense of collection exceeded what they collected. Local strongmen might begin resolving disputes that imperial courts had once handled. Each individual withdrawal made economic sense. The cost-benefit analysis favored reducing imperial presence, but cumulatively, these withdrawals meant the empire was contracting. Populations in these regions sometimes noticed, sometimes they did not. If imperial control had been light and tax burdens modest, little changed when the empire withdrew. If control had been heavy and taxes high, the withdrawal might be welcomed. Local power structures filled the vacuum. Sometimes these were former imperial officials who stayed after imperial power left. Sometimes they were local elites who had been subordinate to imperial authority. Sometimes they were outsiders who moved into the power vacuum. The empire's perspective was that it still controlled these regions. Maps showed borders, treaties existed, but actual control had become theoretical, and theoretical control did not generate tax revenue. This created a fiscal crisis. The empire still had expenses associated with maintaining a large state, but revenue declined as peripheral regions effectively seceded, even if no formal declaration of independence occurred. The gap between revenue and expenses grew. The usual response was to increase tax rates on the regions that remained under control. This accelerated the process of erosion as more regions found imperial association more costly than beneficial and drifted toward autonomy. Tax systems often increased inequality even when that was not their stated purpose. This happened through multiple mechanisms. Those with resources could navigate complexity. They hired experts. They understood exemptions. They had relationships with officials. Their effective tax rate was lower than the nominal rate. Those without resources paid something closer to the full rate. They could not afford expert advice. They did not have connections. They lacked the literacy to challenge assessments or claim exemptions they might technically qualify for. Over time, this widened the wealth gap. The wealthy accumulated more because they paid less proportionally. The poor accumulated less because they paid more proportionally. Taxation, which was theoretically supposed to fund public goods that benefited everyone, in practice often transferred resources from the vulnerable to the powerful. Populations noticed this inequality. It created resentment, not always active resistance, but a sense that the system was fundamentally unfair. This resentment undermined the legitimacy that empires needed to function smoothly. Legitimate empires could tax relatively efficiently because most people accepted the system as basically fair, even if they did not like it. When legitimacy eroded, enforcement costs increased. More soldiers were needed to collect taxes, more administrators were needed to prevent evasion, more auditors were needed to watch the administrators. Each layer of enforcement cost money, which required more taxation, which generated more resentment. Some empires attempted to address inequality through tax reform. They created more progressive systems, where the wealthy paid higher rates. They eliminated exemptions that primarily benefited elites. They increased taxes on luxury goods. These reforms occasionally succeeded in the short term, but over time, the wealthy found new ways to reduce their obligations. They restructured their assets. They moved wealth to jurisdictions with lower rates. They influenced policy through proximity to power. The system gradually returned to favoring those with resources. The pattern repeated across different empires and different centuries. Initial tax systems that were relatively equitable became increasingly skewed toward protecting wealth. Attempts at reform made temporary improvements. Then the underlying forces reasserted themselves. The cycle continued until external shocks disrupted it entirely. Through all of this, ordinary life continued. This is easy to forget when discussing systems and empires. But most people, most of the time, were not thinking about tax policy or imperial decline. They were planting crops, raising children, repairing homes, celebrating marriages, mourning deaths. The fundamental rhythms of human existence proceeded regardless of what empires did. Tax collection was a recurring disruption to this life, but it was not the entirety of life. A farmer might resent surrendering half his harvest, but he still had the other half. He still had his family. He still had his neighbors. He still had the knowledge passed down from his parents about when to plant and when to harvest. Communities developed coping mechanisms. They shared resources in bad years. They helped neighbors who fell behind on tax obligations. They found ways to supplement agricultural income. They adapted. This resilience was remarkable. It meant that societies could endure tax burdens that seemed economically impossible. The official economy might be contracting, but informal networks of mutual support allowed people to survive. But resilience had limits. Each generation that adapted to a slightly heavier burden passed on slightly less to the next generation. The accumulated wealth that had once cushioned bad years diminished. The tools and land that could have improved productivity were sold to meet tax obligations. The traditional knowledge that fathers taught sons was lost when sons left agriculture for cities. Resilience allowed systems to continue longer than they economically should have, but it did not prevent eventual collapse. It simply delayed it, spreading the pain across more generations. Once tax systems reached a certain size and complexity, they became nearly impossible to dismantle. Too many people depended on them for their livelihood. Tax collectors had careers and families. Record keepers had specialized knowledge. Administrators had status and income. Soldiers were paid from tax revenue. The entire imperial structure rested on continued taxation. This created institutional momentum. Even rulers who might have wanted to reduce taxation found it difficult. Reducing taxes meant reducing the apparatus of collection. That meant unemploying thousands of officials. It meant shrinking the military. It meant cutting services that populations had come to expect. The political cost of reduction often exceeded any benefit, so taxation continued at established levels or increased regardless of whether the economy could sustain it. Some empires attempted radical simplification. They would announce that all previous tax codes were void and implement a single, simple system. Everyone would pay the same rate, no exemptions, no complexity. These radical reforms rarely lasted. Special interests immediately began lobbying for exceptions. Military veterans argued they deserved preferential treatment. Religious institutions claimed traditional immunities. Frontier regions argued they needed lower rates to encourage settlement. Each argument had merit in isolation. And so complexity returned. Within a generation, the simplified system had accumulated enough exceptions and special cases to be nearly as complex as what it replaced. The cycle would continue until the next attempted simplification. The system had become self-perpetuating. It existed because it existed. It continued because stopping it was more difficult than maintaining it, and so it continued, even when everyone could see it was causing harm. The destruction that taxation caused was not visible in any single year or decade. It was visible across centuries. A region that had supported a population of 100,000 might, 3 centuries later, support only 30,000. The decline was so gradual that no generation saw it clearly. Each generation simply knew that there were fewer neighbors than their grandparents described, less land under cultivation, fewer villages. The causes were multiple. Climate sometimes changed, diseases sometimes spread, invasions sometimes occurred. But sustained heavy taxation was usually part of the explanation. It was the background pressure that made populations less resilient to other challenges. When a drought came, it hit an agricultural system that had been weakened by decades of heavy extraction. Populations that might have weathered one bad year could not weather several. When disease spread, it affected communities that were already nutritionally stressed from surrendering too much of their production. The tax system did not cause the drought or the disease, but it made their effects worse. And because the effects were separated in time from the cause, the connection was not obvious. Imperial records sometimes showed this decline. Population registers indicated decreasing numbers. Tax revenues from specific regions decreased over long periods. Agricultural land was reclassified as waste or wilderness. But these were just numbers in archives. The people who lived through the decline experienced it differently. They knew life was harder than the old stories described. They adapted as best they could. They did not necessarily understand they were living through a long collapse. They simply knew that survival required constant effort and that prosperity was something their ancestors had known, but they did not. These patterns were not unique to any single empire. They appeared repeatedly across different cultures and different continents. Chinese dynasties followed predictable cycles. A new dynasty would establish itself with relatively light taxation. The economy would flourish. Population would grow. Then tax demands would increase to fund expansion and administration. Agricultural productivity would begin declining. Peasant unrest would grow. The dynasty would lose legitimacy and eventually fall. A new dynasty would emerge, restart the cycle. Mediterranean empires showed similar trajectories. Rome, Byzantium, the Ottoman Empire. Each began with relatively efficient tax systems and ended with systems that had become extractive and destructive. The specific details varied, but the underlying dynamic was consistent. Even empires that learned from others' mistakes eventually fell into similar patterns. Administrators might understand intellectually that heavy taxation was harmful, but the immediate pressures they faced, military threats, administrative costs, infrastructure needs, pushed them toward the same decisions their predecessors had made. This suggests something fundamental about how tax systems evolve in empires. The initial motivation is reasonable: provide order, defense, public goods. But once the system exists, it develops momentum. It grows to meet perceived needs. Those needs always seem urgent and legitimate to those making decisions. The harm accumulates slowly in places distant from where decisions are made. By the time the harm is undeniable, the system has become so embedded that changing it seems impossible. And so it continues until external forces collapse it entirely. The repetition of this pattern across unconnected empires suggests it emerges from basic incentives inherent in large-scale governance. It is not unique to particular cultures or periods. It is something that happens when human organizations reach certain sizes and complexity levels. These patterns did not end with ancient empires. They continue in modified forms. Modern states collect taxes through different mechanisms: electronic transfers rather than grain seizures, income taxes rather than agricultural tithes. But the fundamental dynamics are similar. Resources flow from dispersed populations to central authorities. Complex rules develop over time. Those with resources navigate the complexity better than those without. Administrative costs grow. The distance between those who pay and those who decide how the money is spent creates the same disconnections that existed in ancient empires. Modern states have some advantages. Better communication means the disconnect between center and periphery is less severe. Democratic processes sometimes allow taxpayers to influence policy in ways ancient farmers could not. Economic growth sometimes expands the total wealth enough that extraction does not cause absolute decline. But the basic incentives remain. Governments always have spending priorities that seem urgent and necessary. Taxation is the mechanism to fund those priorities. The political cost of reducing spending is usually higher than the political cost of maintaining taxation. So taxation persists at high levels, even when economists argue it harms long-term growth. The vocabulary has changed. Ancient empires spoke of tribute and tax farming. Modern states speak of progressive taxation and public goods. But the underlying question remains the same. How much can be extracted from productive activity before that activity is reduced? Where is the line between sustainable revenue and destructive burden? History suggests that most governments, most of the time, do not find that line carefully. They cross it gradually, often without realizing they have done so until the consequences are already unfolding.
History does not provide clear lessons. Different people draw different conclusions from the same events. Some observers note that empires with heavy taxation eventually collapsed and conclude that taxation caused collapse. Others note that empires with light taxation also eventually collapsed and conclude that taxation was not the determining factor. Both perspectives have merit. Taxation alone does not determine whether a civilization thrives or declines. Climate, geography, culture, technology, leadership, all of these matter. But taxation shapes the constraints within which all these other factors operate. Heavy, sustained taxation reduces the surplus available for innovation and adaptation. It weakens the economic foundation that supports everything else. It does not make collapse inevitable, but it makes societies more vulnerable when other challenges arise. Light taxation preserves more economic flexibility, but it also means governments have fewer resources to address collective problems. There is a balance somewhere, though history suggests that balance is difficult to find and harder to maintain. The empires that lasted longest were often those that kept taxation relatively moderate and adjusted it based on economic conditions. When harvests were good, they collected more. When harvests failed, they collected less. They maintained the long-term productivity of their economic base rather than maximizing short-term revenue. But this required wisdom and restraint from rulers who faced constant pressure to spend more. It required administrative systems that provided accurate information about economic conditions. It required legitimate governance where populations trusted that their sacrifices served genuine common purposes. These conditions were rare. More often, empires overtaxed because the immediate pressures to do so were strong and the long-term consequences were distant and uncertain. Tax systems that destroyed empires did not suddenly stop. They gradually became irrelevant as the empires themselves faded. Collection became sporadic. Officials stopped visiting remote regions. Records fell into disarray. Local populations simply stopped paying, and no one came to enforce collection. In some cases, successor states emerged with new tax systems. Sometimes these were lighter because new rulers had not yet built the administrative apparatus to collect efficiently. Sometimes they were heavier because new rulers needed to establish legitimacy and fund rapid expansion. In other cases, formal taxation disappeared for generations. Local strongmen collected tribute from immediate areas, but nothing resembling imperial tax systems persisted. Trade continued on a smaller scale. Agricultural production continued, but at lower intensity. Populations adapted to the absence of imperial structures.
These transitions were often violent, but sometimes they were simply administrative. Imperial officials stopped arriving. Their last visits were months apart, then years. Eventually, people realized no one was coming, and they stopped preparing for collection that never occurred. The physical infrastructure of taxation often outlasted the systems themselves. Warehouse buildings became repurposed for other uses. Roads built to move tax goods carried trade for centuries after the empires that built them vanished. Aqueducts continued supplying water long after the administrative systems that maintained them dissolved. And the populations that had lived under heavy taxation adapted to its absence. They did not suddenly become prosperous because the economic damage of sustained extraction took generations to heal. But the immediate pressure eased. Resources that had flowed to distant capitals stayed in local communities. Slowly, over decades, economic activity recovered.
The empires that taxation helped build and then helped destroy were temporary. The human activities they taxed were not. Farming continued before, during, and after empires. Families raised children before, during, and after empires. Communities supported their members before, during, and after empires. Empires were organized attempts to capture and redirect the surplus these activities produced. They succeeded for a time. They provided order, defense, sometimes prosperity. But they also extracted. And when extraction exceeded what could be sustainably produced, the empires that depended on that extraction weakened. This does not mean empires were purely negative. Organization at scale allowed achievements that smaller communities could not accomplish. Infrastructure, legal systems, cultural achievements. These often outlasted the empires that created them. But it suggests that the relationship between organized states and productive populations has inherent tensions. States need resources to function. Populations need to retain enough of what they produce to maintain their productive capacity. Finding the balance is difficult. Maintaining it over generations is more difficult still. Throughout history, most attempts to find this balance eventually failed. Not always catastrophically, not always quickly, but eventually the accumulated stress of sustained extraction exceeded the resilience of productive populations. What followed was decline, reorganization, or replacement. The specific mechanisms varied by time and place, but the underlying dynamic was consistent enough to be recognizable across widely different contexts. Taxation, when heavy and sustained, wore down the foundations it depended upon. The process was gradual enough to be invisible to any single generation, but over the long span of history, the pattern repeated clearly. History moves in patterns that are not quite cycles. Similar dynamics recur, but never identically. New empires form with lessons learned from their predecessors' failures. They design better tax systems. They avoid obvious mistakes. For a time, they succeed. Then, new circumstances create new pressures. The tax system adjusts. Complexity grows. The same underlying dynamics reassert themselves. This is not inevitable in the sense that it must happen. Human institutions can be designed differently. Choices can be made that lead to different outcomes. But the incentives that push toward heavy taxation are strong and continuous, while the forces that resist it are weak and intermittent. Rulers face immediate pressures, military threats, administrative costs, popular demands for services. Reducing taxation helps future generations, but creates present difficulties. Increasing taxation solves present problems, but creates future difficulties. The time horizon of political decision-making usually favors the present. This means that even when decision-makers understand intellectually that heavy taxation is harmful, they often increase it anyway because the alternatives seem worse. This individual rationality
repeated across many decisions and many years, produces the collective irrationality of systems that undermine themselves. Understanding this does not provide simple solutions. The pressures that drove ancient empires to overtax still exist. Modern states face different specific challenges, but similar underlying dynamics. The question is not whether taxation should exist. Organized societies require some resource mobilization. The question is how to prevent the gradual escalation that makes taxation destructive. History suggests this question has no permanent answer. It must be addressed continuously, generation after generation, with vigilance about the patterns that have appeared before. Empires that taxation helped destroy are now studied in universities. Their ruins attract tourists. Their histories fill libraries. But for the people who lived through those times, it was simply life. They planted and harvested. They raised children. They adapted to the demands placed upon them. They did not know they were living through historical patterns that scholars would later analyze. The pressure of taxation was one pressure among many: drought, disease, conflict, family obligations, daily survival. Taxation was significant, but it was not the entirety of existence. And when empires finally weakened and dissolved, life continued. Different governing structures emerged. Different tax systems were implemented. The fundamental activities of human life proceeded. This perspective is worth maintaining. Tax systems destroyed empires, but empires are political organizations. They are not identical to the civilizations they governed or the people who lived under them. When we say taxation destroyed empires, we mean it undermined the organizational capacity of large political structures. We do not mean it destroyed human communities entirely. Those communities persisted, adapted, reorganized. The destruction was real. The suffering was real. The loss of order and security that empires provided was real. But so was the resilience of ordinary human life. So was the capacity of communities to rebuild after political structures collapsed. History is filled with endings, imperial endings, dynastic endings, administrative endings, but also with continuations, agricultural continuations, family continuations, cultural continuations. The empires that taxation helped destroy were not permanent. Neither was the destruction they experienced. The pattern of taxation and decline repeats because the incentives that create it are inherent in how large organizations function. States need resources. Productive populations generate those resources. The process of extraction has costs. Those costs accumulate slowly. The accumulation eventually exceeds what can be sustained. Systems adjust or dissolve. This has happened many times. It will likely happen again in different forms. The specific mechanisms change. The underlying dynamics remain similar. Understanding this does not provide solutions exactly, but it provides perspective. The challenges that taxation creates for organized societies are not new. They have been faced before. They will be faced again. Each generation makes choices about how to balance immediate needs against long-term sustainability. Each generation has imperfect information and faces pressures their ancestors did not face. But they also have access to history, to patterns that have appeared before, to knowledge about what worked and what failed. Whether that knowledge is used well is another question, one that each time and place must answer for itself. The empires that taxation destroyed left behind ruins, roads, aqueducts, written records.
These remnants allow later generations to study what happened and perhaps make better choices. Or perhaps they will make the same choices, face the same pressures, follow the same patterns, reach the same eventual outcomes. History does not determine the future, but it suggests what is possible, what is likely, what has happened before when similar conditions existed.
These patterns unfolded across centuries, slowly, gradually, without drama or sudden moments. Systems that began reasonably became burdensome. Populations that were prosperous became strained. Empires that were powerful became weak. Not through catastrophe, through accumulation, through small decisions repeated, through pressures applied steadily over time. The end result was the same, but the process was so gradual that most people living through it did not perceive it as ending. They simply lived their lives within changing circumstances. And eventually, the empires that taxation had helped build and taxation had helped weaken faded. Not always violently, sometimes simply becoming less relevant, less capable, less present, until they were memory, and then history, and then subjects that scholars study to understand patterns that repeat. The destruction was quiet, the way most historical changes are quiet when you are living through them. One year following another, one generation following another, systems adjusting, people adapting, until eventually the adjustment is so complete that what existed before is no longer recognizable, and new systems emerge to face similar questions and make similar choices, and the patterns continue.